You need a long memory to recall sights like this, a Great Western locomotive in full cry with the Torbay Express. The sound of its approach was nothing compared to the ear-splitting volume on the footplate. These two men have several hundred lives in their hands. It's the same scale of responsibility as the crew of a jumbo jet. But the astonishing difference between this and any other vehicle was that you produced your own power supply as you went along. The fuel pump was a shovel. While the fireman was turning coal and water into speed, the driver concentrated on delivering this Dickensian furnace safely to the seaside. And it was all achieved with an outward show of elegance, for nothing compared to the sight of a Great Western castle streaking across the skyline. It's a bygone world, but a dwindling number of men can remember life on the footplate of a castle, when a day's work consisted of shovelling several tons of coal.
The tender held 7 ton, and by the time you got back, it'd all gone. You'd shovelled 7 ton of coal. As well as taking water, sweeping up, cleaning down, looking for signals, you just didn't stop. You was on the go all the time.
In the glorious summer of 2003, one of the old Castle-class engines was unexpectedly called back into mainline service to head the Torbay Express between Bristol and Kingswear. But how would a museum piece cope with a 75-mile-an-hour dash to the seaside? The devoted volunteers who look after the engine were confident in its ability, and among them was a man who started work on castles 50 years ago. His cap, issued to him as a lad at Swindon, will go with him to the grave.
That's going in my box with me when I die. When I pass on, this hat's going in my box. I've told my son that when my turn comes, don't matter what state the hat's in, it goes in the box with me. Oh yeah.
So it's a lifetime love affair. But men like Ray Rice would rather see engines out on the main line where they belong, scattering the livestock as they race through the west of England. Until as recently as the 1960s, it was the railway that held far-flung communities together and brought the seaside closer to the cities. Branch lines ran out like veins through every limb of the land, and the heartbeat of this system could be heard from every passing chimney. Britain's market towns were still uncluttered by traffic, and its castles gave their names to the express engines of the Great Western Railway. Inside the workshops of the Great Western Society at Didcot, the exiled engines are returned to life, and high up on the ceiling is a famous headboard, almost forgotten after so many years. The Torbay Express served Torquay, a line that ends on the banks of the River Dart at Kingswear. While other people's engines invade Brunel's railway. Only a few yards from the main line, the reborn Great Western engines emerge one by one from Didcot. It's one of the best railway heritage centres in the world, but space is limited.
Didcot is actually in the centre of a mainline triangle, and we are on a 17-acre site, and our main running line, demonstration line, call it what you will, is only about 2/3 of a mile long. So especially engines of this size, they're like caged lions chomping at the bit ready to get out.
It was in the spring of 1998 that Castle class engine 5051 began chomping at the bit to get out. The engine is seen here emerging from a rebuild, its paintwork still unlined and coupled to one of the old-style small tenders. It had originally been named Dryslewin Castle, but for most of its life carried the name Earl Bathurst. Carl Buckingham was at the controls that day, never imagining that 5 years later he'd be taking the same engine deep into Devon. The Dart Estuary, with its famous naval college, is one of Britain's great maritime playgrounds, and still has a working steam railway connecting with the main line at Paignton. Someone had the bright idea of running steam hauled specials from Bristol on summer Sundays. The engine booked for the job wasn't a Castle, but a survivor from a smaller class of engines named after manors. Number 7802 Bradley Manor set out on the first train from Temple Meads with an ex-Bristol train spotter at the controls.
I used to do my spotting at Lawrenceville Station, which is the first station out of Bristol going towards Bristol Parkway as it is now. Also used to come down obviously at Temple Meads when I was a youngster. But I never ever believed then when I used to see the trains go through Lawrenceville that one day I should be driving a steam engine through there.
Jeff Ewens joined the railway 20 years ago after working as a Bristol milkman.
Always been interested in steam. Never been involved with steam, but ever since I was the old train spotting days, I've always been interested in steam. And I just thought back in 1984 when I was 38, you look back in life, you think, sometimes you think in life, you think, well, I wish I'd done that, wish I'd done this, and I just sent off to the railway, hoping to come on as a guard. But I started carriage cleaning on permanent nights over St Philip's Marsh, cleaning HSTs.
With Jeff at the helm, the first trip seemed to be going well, but unknown to him, one of the driving axle boxes was running hot. The engine was stuck at the Dart Railway. Failed bearings were a fact of life in steam days. Another engine would be whistled up from the nearest shed to take over, but in the 21st century things aren't so simple. With Bradley Manor out of action, another mainline certified engine was needed, preferably a Great Western one. Cancellation was unthinkable, with the Torbay Express rapidly becoming a sellout. Fortunately, the perfect replacement was waiting in the wings. The Earl would be going to the seaside.
It was a very 11th hour sort of short notice call. What happened was, throughout August, Bradley Manor 7802 was supposed to be running these trips, and on its first weekend it ran a hot right hand back axle box. The bearing actually overheated and some of the metal ran out. So what they've done, they've given us a phone call on the Monday morning of the second week. We never turn down a mainline run, whatever happens. We will bend over backwards to get the old girl ready. Because actually on the previous weekend to the phone call, this old girl was in a lot of parts, and I worked right through the week and most evenings getting her ready, as you do. and it was actually running on the previous Wednesday on our own site back at Didcot, and we had to sort of clamber in the smoke box, but it's still hot and that, and put all the spark guards in it ready to come out on the main line. And the weather being what it's like lately, it's serious dehydration and a lot of sweat. I looked like I'd been in the shower fully clothed when I came out of there.
For the next 2 weeks, home for Earl Bathurst would be the EWS Motive Power Depot at Barton Hill in Bristol, among the Class 67 and 66 diesels. But while you can start a diesel at the touch of a button, each outing for the Earl would involve 2 days of preparation by a 6-man support crew.
At the minute, the chaps are doing their individual jobs. Morris, as you see by the wheels, is actually oiling up all the motion and the working parts. Graham and myself are going to go underneath and empty the ash pan and check all for loose nuts and bolts and so forth. The other Graham, he's actually going to follow around and tighten up any loose nuts and bolts that we find. Young Ed, round the far side, he's going to repack a valve gland and that on the outside spindle there. And basically the rest of us will just sort of make up the numbers and clean it in a few minutes' time.
A good old-fashioned hammer is the best way to find any loose nuts and bolts.
As you can see, that one there is very loose, so that'll have to be tightened, see. It's what the chaps will follow around with a spanner, and I'll put a white mark on it so they can see it.
Morris Williams has taken charge of the oil can, which on a Western engine is a real labour of love.
Well, I've not really counted, and I think each castle varies slightly. I think there's about 160, 70, maybe 80, but it does slightly vary between engines, because sometimes on one engine on the top of an axle box, which I've just done, you only have 1 cork. Sometimes there's 2, so it varies slightly.
The team are all too aware of the possibility of a breakdown. Indeed, it had happened a few weeks earlier in May, when 5051 stormed up to Whiteball Summit behind sister ship 5029 on a Plymouth Express. But on the return trip, Earl Bathurst was missing, her place taken by a Class 47 diesel. She was left behind at Plymouth with mechanical problems. Worse still, 5 minutes after passing here, a man on the remaining castle was injured by falling masonry. With all steam trips, there's an element of fingers crossed.
There's a hell of a lot of stress and strains on the poor old girls like this that's nearly 70 odd years old. Every time you take an engine out, it's a calculated risk nowadays. In May of 2003, we had a double-headed run with Nunney Castle to Plymouth, and basically our inside eccentric straps, bearing surfaces, they run hot and the metal melted out, and we had to borrow 2 parts from Pendennis Castle, which we've got in bits at Didcot. Luck would have it, they fitted perfectly, and we're still running with them today, waiting for our own to be mended.
A Virgin Voyager passing its home and shed has had its place taken temporarily by Earl Bathurst. They've been bringing it gently to the boil all day, in readiness for its trip the following morning. But it'll have to pass an inspection first, the fitness to run examination. Consultant engineer Roger Patterson has been brought in to make sure the castle is safe to run at speed. He's got nearly 140 tonnes of machinery to examine, and one of the many jobs is to look at the front end, inside the smoke box, where the mesh screens of the spark arrestor are visible. It's been the driest summer for years, and the fear of line-side fires has already led to a steam ban on the southern region. Back in steam days, there was great pride in the way engines were turned out. This is Clun Castle in typically spotless condition. But towards the end, with fewer school leavers prepared to take dirty jobs on the railways, cleanliness suffered. The men from Didcot won't let that happen to their engine, and after a long day comes the backbreaking job of removing every possible spot of dirt. For people not familiar with the cab of a castle, there's also a chance for a guide to the basic controls.
This is the working part of the engine where the driver and the fireman operate. Basically, layman's terms, I'll try and simplify it as best you can. The regulator is what supplies the steam from the boiler down to the valve chest. In turn, the valves are controlled by this little gadget here, which simplified is like the gears of a car. You've got your forward and your reverse. Simple. To start the engine off, you wind that right down to full forward gear, which is 75% of the cut off of steam. And then basically you just lift your regulator. You've got two settings, half open and full open. Then after the steam comes from the regulator, it drops to the valves and you shorten the travel of the valve for the faster acceleration. The stop side of the engine is controlled by the brakes. You've got your large ejector, which is controlled by this valve, and the small ejector controlled by that valve. Basically what you do, you just pull them down. Excuse the noise. You pull them down, it creates a vacuum in the gauge. When you've got full boiler pressure, it will go up to 25 inches, but at the minute we can't show you that. Basically, you've created your vacuum. When you want to apply the brakes to slow down or stop, all you do is just let the air back into the vacuum system, like that, and that just pushes the brakes onto the wheels. Right.
The last job this evening is a change of identity. The engine will carry 2 sets of nameplates plus a variety of head codes, which is sure to confuse people at the line side.
When she was built in 1936, it was named Swindon Castle, and it carried that name for approximately 18 months of its life, in the first 18 months, and then it was renamed to the engine you see it this morning as Earl Bathurst, which it carried for the rest of its days. And tomorrow we are planning, time permitting, we're going to run in the morning as Earl Bathurst, and then hopefully we will change it back to Swindon Castle to come home with. Even I can't say it after all these years. It's a Welsh name and it's a tongue twister.
The next morning, the engine feels the weight of its 9-coach train for the first time. Just over 300 tons is an easy load for a castle except on the steepest banks. With the drain cocks open to clear the cylinders of any water, she starts the empty stock away towards Temple Mead Station. The castle should make easy work of the Torbay Express compared to the smaller Manor.
It's 4 cylinders and it's got a higher tractive effort. It's designed to do the prestige higher loading runs. Manors were secondary to mixed traffic routes and only would have pulled 7 or 8 coaches at most. Whereas we've got the same load with a bigger engine, it is actually playing with the same load. So it's just like a toy train to this one.
The other big difference is the castle's wheel diameter, just over a foot greater, so it's allowed to run at 75 miles an hour against the Manor's 60. Ray Rice remembers the castles in action.
What we used to do, ties them in, we used to relieve Chestermen at Snow Hill. We used to work to Oxford with 2 stops. Very, very rare that you had a bad one. Always in top class condition. Fire was always good, coal was always good. Never had a problem. All the ones that I done, never had a problem on any of them. Steamed all the way there, no problem at all.
The first water stop is Taunton. It's going well, but Carl Buckingham and his colleagues can't relax.
You're always concerned for the wicking, the trimming that feeds the oil down into the different parts. You're always making sure everything's in place, it's properly oiled up. You always check for the fire, there's no clinker in the fire, and the right amount of water to be taken on board at each water stop. It's a hell of a lesson, it's all permutating in your mind all the time.
The professional EWS engine men are getting ready for some hill climbing. Ahead lies the famous Wellington Bank, which culminates at Whiteball Tunnel. Jeff Ewens seems relaxed.
Yeah, she's been going really, really well. Yeah, no problem at all.
Is this an engine you particularly like? Is it a good one?
It is a good one. Well, the Casses were the cream of the Great Western, weren't they? So, yeah, I like driving Casses and firing Casses.
The pressure gauge is nudging the red line.
Yeah, I just opened the enlarged injector to create the 25 inches of vacuum.
Bob, are you happy with your fire? I mean, how's she looking, mate? All right? Yeah, fine. Up on the mark, no problem? No, not yet.
Well, we got the green. There we go.
Right away.
Right away. Just open the regulator, the injector to go in. Just cut off again, back to 65%.
They'll be trailed into Devon by a diesel, but this time they're hoping it'll be redundant.
Round her back down about 35%. Approaching victory crossing, look at that. Gradually increasing, doing 55 mile an hour. This is on a rising gradient.
The rising gradient Jeff mentioned is the long climb near Wellington through the Blackdown Hills, reaching 1 in 80 before the tunnel. They've just passed the town of Wellington in the distance, and the hill is getting steeper.
Down a bit now, drop her down to 35. I think I'm going to leave her in that and let her find her own way up to the back. We are now on the steepest part of the climb, the Wellington Bank. We're a famous 50-year forum. Let's take at 102 mile an hour on the Elk Road in 1904.
Inside the tunnel, as the pitch black is relieved a little by cracking open the firehole doors, you can just see Jeff crouching down with one hand still on the regulator.
Oh yes, I was operating the sanders. The first week I went up, she did slip in the tunnel, so when I go in there now, I just put a bit of sand down to stop her slipping.
Doing about 38 miles an hour. All right, Bob? Yeah. Well done, mate. All downhill now, Bob.
Ray Rice remembers well the art form of firing when it was a daily routine 50 years ago.
Oh, well, you've got to keep the corners well filled in the firebox, because if you've got any air holes in the fire, you'll soon see the needle come down on your steam pressure gauge. Keep the flap up, keep plenty in the back corners. Just hope that the engine reacts right to your effort. There's nothing worse than putting a lot of effort into trying to steam an engine when it won't steam. And the reasons for that is, more often than not, is clinker on the fire bars. But if you've got an engine that's free steaming, on I say, steaming like a kettle, you can flash a bit round, put the flap up, you can sit down, roll yourself a fag, and the needle stops on the red mark.
Before they can reach their permitted maximum of 75, there's a hitch. Nothing to do with the engine, it's just that there's a low bridge, and the castle will be a tight fit.
I'm wondering if not this bridge, the next bridge. For clearance purposes. I think it's this next one, Clive. This next bridge. It's the clearance, I think.
The bridge hasn't got any lower. It's more a case of the track getting higher, for there's a tendency of permanent way to be built up.
This how much room there is there. All right. Open her up again, drop her down to 30, back up with the second ball, I think. Cut off just a bit, speed going.
Bob, the fireman's too busy to watch the traffic on the M5 motorway alongside, but Traction Inspector Clive Rooker gets a grandstand view. We British still head for the seaside in droves, but perhaps it was more exciting to arrive there by train.
What I like about the GWR is the sound. They got a bark to the exhaust, haven't they? I mean, you can go on a Southern Merchant Navy and it's just a chuff chuff, and I like to hear them work. Yeah.
and the place to hear them working is among the Devon hills.
We went to picture, it's a wonderful journey down. I think we arrived about 5 minutes early. No problem with the engine at all.
The castle took both trips in its stride with every seat sold. And the thing about high-speed working is that when the engine arrives back at Didcot, it seems to run better. A bit of exercise blows the cobwebs away, and you can almost sense the Earl dreaming of that next trip. Dawn on a summer Sunday. There's hardly a breath of wind to chase away the mist that lingers over the River Avon at Bath. It hasn't rained for a month, and today is forecast to be another scorcher. The hot air balloonists have a grandstand view of a piece of living history as a Great Western steam locomotive lays down another ribbon of mist along the river valley. Number 7802 Bradley Manor is back in traffic, resuming its place at the head of the Torbay Express, heading Bathurst, and the bigger substitute performed perfectly. But now 5051 is back at Didcot, among the Great Western Society's unsurpassed GWR fleet. Its place at Barton Hill, the Bristol freight depot, has been taken over by the Manor class engine. A support team from Bradley Manor's home railway, the Severn Valley, is bringing the engine back to life after its 2-week layoff for axle bearing repairs. It was during the 1930s that the Great Western announced the birth of a bouncing baby to add to its family of named locomotives. The engines were named after manors in the West Country, and they used the 5 feet 8 inch wheels of the GWR's mixed traffic fleet. The logic of the Great Western 460 engines can be seen at a glance at the two most prolific classes. The Hall has the 6-foot wheels and 2 outside cylinders of the classic mainline made-of-all work, while the Castle, with driving wheels 8.5 inches taller and 4 cylinders for sustained high-speed running, is an out-and-out express machine. But the axle loading of both was too heavy for some secondary routes, and so along came the Manor, with 2 cylinders just like the Halls, but with smaller wheels and boiler. It was slimmer by several tons, and became the pocket battleship of the GWR, quite powerful and able to reach the furthest outposts of Empire.
The largest engines, Kings, Castles, Stars and the like, they're 4-cylinder engines with large driving wheels, well over 6 feet. And the purpose of those is running long distances at reasonably high speeds. And then you come down then to the what they call the more mixed traffic engines. You've got Halls, Granges, Manors, and previous to them, Saints. And the Manor is the smallest of the named 460 mixed traffic engines. Its real reason for existence was to work over lines where the heavier engines weren't permitted.
Just 30 manors were built. That's exactly the same number as the kings and counties. But construction of the manors was split either side of the war. Bradley Manor was the third engine to be built.
Built in 1938, incorporating second-hand parts for some earlier engines, surprisingly, some earlier Great Western 260 engines. There's certain parts on the engine even now that are stamped with the numbers of those locos. Initially allocated to Old Oak Common Depot in London, and then worked most of the war actually from Bristol depots, St Philip's Marsh and Bath Road depots, and by the late 1940s had found its way to the Cambrian system in mid-Wales and spent virtually all of the rest of its working life there until 1965.
The day before its final trip to Torbay, the volunteer support crew are adding 3 tons of coal to the tender. Hydraulic hoists and half-ton ballast sacks make the job easier. It's amusing to observe that even a small 460 engine makes a truck look like a dinky toy. Some of these men have been looking after Bradley Manor and its sister engine, Earlstoke Manor, for 30 years. That's longer than the engine's working life. Whole classes of Great Western 460s were lost, including all 80 of the Grange class engines, so it's little short of a miracle that nearly a third of the manors escaped the cutter's torch.
Pure luck, there's still 9 engines out of 30 that were built. One of those was sold direct by British Railways out of service, and that's Cookham Manor that's now based at Didcot. The other 8 were sold to a scrap merchant, Mr Woodham in South Wales at Barry, and were successively rescued between their arrival in the late 60s and about 1990 from that scrapyard and put back into working order. And one of the reasons that they've survived is that they are very useful on preserved lines, the Severn Valley Railway, West Somerset Railway, lines of that sort of size. And of course, having a name, they have a reasonable attraction to the public as well.
They're also very powerful engines. If you take the nominal tractive effort, which is admittedly a very limited measurement, then the Manor is technically more powerful than that greatest mixed traffic engine of them all, the LMS Black 5. In fact, the Manor isn't far behind a Bullid. 400 pounds or so of tractive effort separate a West Country from a Manor. Of course, they're completely different animals. The Bullid would leave a Manor standing, but not when pulling away. So what makes the Manor a better bet on, say, a slippery incline?
Right, well again it's back to the size of the wheels and the size of the cylinders. And I mean, the fact these engines are designed for that sort of climbing work, I mean, they originate from a family of engines designed by Mr Churchward in the early years of the last century. And I mean, it's no secret that he originated from Devon, so he was well familiar with some of the gradients they got down there. And a lot of his thinking which is perpetuated into these engines, although they bear the name of a later designer, is around hill climbing and tackling rather adverse sections of railway. So you've got whole families of engines that have got very similar parts, but are known for being sure-footed and capable of holding reasonable loads on quite steep gradients. I mean, the Castle would have a larger load capacity, but this one would probably beat the Castle up, say, Tor Bank, because it would be able to get away quicker at the bottom of the bank with the smaller wheels.
And here is the Castle with 9 coaches tackling Tor Bank, the 1 in 55 climb out of Torquay. It's hard work for a castle, but the smaller manor will be at its limit with a load of 9.
From memory, something like 308 tonne is the maximum load up there. When we say the maximum load, we mean the maximum load to keep time. We don't mean the maximum load under any circumstances. I mean, the real maximum load, of course, would be the maximum load that engine would restart if it had to stop on the bank. But 308 tonne, from my memory, is the normal timing load up there. And I mean, the engine has to take its time with that sort of load. There's no point in trying to force it to go even faster, but you should be able to go up at a steady 15, 20, 25 mile an hour. And you're not going to go up 50 or 60 mile an hour or anything like that.
And how's she done on the run?
Oh, quite well, because I mean the engine's in reasonably good mechanical condition. I mean, they're not allowed out on the national network if they're not. So she's quite capable of running up to the permitted 60 mile an hour chimney first with this one, whereas the Castle has a higher permitted speed limit. Because of the larger wheels.
This week, rain's forecast. Good news for the gardeners after the driest summer for years, but it might not be good news for Bradley Manor. They're making sure the sanders are topped up to stop any slipping on wet rails. The skies are blue at Bristol, but 50 miles away, the cumulus clouds are gathering above Wellington Bank, already dampening the 1 in 80 gradients. Just a week ago, the last time Bradley Manor climbed the hill, Jeff Ewens could afford to admire the view. Next time he'll be poised for slipping, though at least he won't have to worry about line-side fires.
The weather conditions back in that August, as we know, we had those hot summer, and I wasn't working her that hard because I was a bit concerned about any fire risk. So I did take her a little bit steady going up over Whiteball. Whereas today, I might give it a bit more with this engine because we had rain in the last week.
The engine gets a final polish before setting off. Hundreds of cameras will be pointed at Bradley Manor along the way, so the men want her to look her best. Some of these men are qualified drivers who drive 7802 on the Severn Valley Railway, but it's a different story on the main line, where they must hand over to professional railwaymen who know the route to Torquay and Paignton. Jeff Ewens is well aware he's a lucky man.
When I go to bed, I can't wait for the morning to come to get up. I just look forward to it. It's different. It's different in driving the diesels.
Bradley Manor tiptoes into sleepy Bristol. People will be opening their Sunday papers elsewhere in the city as she leaves Barton Hill to pick up her train. Pressure's on the mark. Bob the fireman looks happy, and Jeff the driver looks back to see that all is well. With a 60 mile an hour maximum speed, the timings are a bit sharper than they were for the Castle, but nothing Bradley Manor can't handle. The vacuum gauge is looking rather reluctant, so you'll see the driver using the large ejector a bit more than usual to pull the brakes off. The draughty cab of a Great Western locomotive was no place to be in the depths of winter, though the engines were well liked.
First class as regards performance and all that, but when it comes to comfort for the crews, very little, especially on a cold, foggy night, on a 28 or a 53, standing on the top loop with the wind blowing and the snow, and nowhere to hide. Them are the ones, yeah, but other than that, good engines.
Going along, you didn't feel it so much because, you know, although you wasn't going all that fast, but you was busy, but when you stopped and went in the loop, whichever way the wind was blowing, you both got to the other side of the engine. You just got off it sometimes and literally stood under the running board by the side of the wheels and where the firebox was. That was when it was really cold in the winter, like, you know.
There's no comfort for the crews, no bucket seats, no sliding windows in the side, just to sail up and your overcoat on and stand up in the corner when you got the opportunity. Oh yeah, yeah.
This is the cab of a Gresley Pacific. Notice the driver's bucket seat and the designer's attempt to put everything within easy reach. Flying Scotsman is older than the Manors, so it's not a case of this being a later design. The truth is that the Great Western Railway just didn't seem to see creature comforts as a design criterion. Not that Jeff Ewens would swap engines, especially here in Great Western Heartland, arriving at Temple Meads with a Devon Express. Bradley Manor is warming to the job, and for the driver this is a real highlight in a life whose earliest memories were of the flow of Great Western Expresses through Brunel's famous curving station. There are differences from steam days. The sharp-eyed will have noticed the row of coloured buttons of the TPWS, which put signals in the cab. Bradley Manor is already fitted with this next generation of safety equipment, which every mainline steam locomotive will have to have. Who would have believed that a wreck from Barry Scrapyard, bought as spares for another engine, would one day return to its former hometown at the head of a mainline express? Or that cattle grazing in the lee of a White Horse Hill would hear a sound that hasn't echoed across this countryside for nearly 40 years. In steam days, it wouldn't have been unusual to see a Manor carrying an express headboard, including the Cambrian Coast Express, when taking the train on from Shrewsbury.
In the 1950s there was a bit of a resurgence in pride on the railways, and certainly these engines were painted again in green livery and lined out, and a number of the services on the western region, which covered the Cambrian area at that time, were converted into named trains. So the Cambrian Coast Express was a through train from Paddington onto the Cambrian line, and from Shrewsbury onwards it will be hauled by a Manor class engine, because that's the largest engine that is capable of working on that line because of the axle load permitted on the bridges and structures on that line.
Half a dozen of the Manors were also based in Devon and Cornwall. Driver Jeff Ewens has now had the chance to drive the Manor and the Castle over the same route with the same load. So, how do the engines compare?
Obviously in acceleration, this engine takes a little bit longer to get up to speed. But she's, for a load of 9, she's a marvellous engine really.
Jeff's noticed that the Manor and the Castle require a slightly different cut-off.
The cut-off is just like the gears in the car. You start off in first gear, which is 75%. And then as you pick up speed, you just gradually sort of wind her back, what we call winding back. In the car you'll be putting her into second gear, and you gradually go up through the gears to... On the Castle, I was running in about 18% cut-off when it's speed. With the Manor, it's about 22. So they do vary on cut-offs.
Jeff Ewens has had several years to learn how to get the best out of steam locomotives over the Devon banks. He fired during the first ever visit of Green Arrow, about to tackle Wellington Bank. In those days, he was usually firing, able to watch other drivers at work. As well as firing Green Arrow over White Ball Summit, he was also privileged to drive Flying Scotsman. Then came a turn at the helm of the A4 Pacific, Union of South Africa.
I used to be a milkman back in 1984, and from driving a milk float to driving a steam engine, would never believe it.
The ex-milkman was also a regular performer on the Dawlish donkey workings along the Devon coast, and found out all about Tor Bank on the footplate of a pannier tank. Today, Jeff Ewens will need all his skill, for the rain has settled in just in time for his arrival at Whiteball. Can the Manor keep her feet? She strolls up the 1 in 80 gradient without losing adhesion once. There is, as usual, an audience at the line side here to see her pass by. But it's not just middle-aged men. Whole families will turn out, even in the rain. The engine owners are pleased to see more young people taking an interest nowadays.
It's nice to see the surprise on people's faces when you go through places that are not accustomed to seeing steam engines. They're usually somewhat startled, often delighted. A few people turn the other way and really couldn't be bothered, but most people are rather pleased to see them, I think.
I've noticed people waving at you. They really like it, don't they?
They tend to, especially if it's something they don't see regularly. I mean, some of the wives of our group might disagree with you on that, but most of the people that wave from the line side are genuinely pleased to see it, really.
Bradley Manor arrives at the last summit of the down journey. This is Churston on the Dart Railway. The Sunday trips have been a smash hit with the travelling public, and there's talk of doing it again next year. But where does the evergreen appeal of this archaic form of transport come from?
Thomas the Tank Engine's been a very good influence on younger children. Certainly Harry Potter's a new, further good influence. But the cost of running engines now, keeping them in running order, is escalating at such a rate that whilst a few will be kept running, it's difficult to see how we're going to keep as many running as there are at the moment. And it's another question as to whether they'll be allowed to run on the national network by then.
Well, we said that back in the late 90s. It's not going to last, but it's still going. They've got this TPWS fitted on these engines now, and they seem to be going on and on and on.
Bradley Manor leaves Kingswear for the last time. It's September now. The kids will be back at school tomorrow, and the engine will return to the Severn Valley Railway. But she'll leave her voice echoing around the River Dart estuary as she climbs away from the harbour. The EWS enginemen will be back driving diesels tomorrow. They're keen the credit for the steam trip should all go to those people who've saved steam for posterity.
Obviously, yeah, and it's not my machine, is it? I think these boys, they put in hours and hours and hours, and if it weren't for them, I wouldn't be doing it.
Perhaps the headboard will come down again next year. Until then, the never-ending restoration work goes on. And will the Red Dragon fly again, or the Capitals United storm once more out of Paddington? Nostalgia won't win the battle to keep the wheels turning. What's needed is more volunteers. Heritage centres like the Great Western Society and the Severn Valley Railway welcome with open arms anyone who wants to help. Of course, people really help every time they turn up to support events like this one at Didcot. Today, it's a mail snatch. 5051 is playing to a packed house. Arguably, the real National Railway Museum isn't a line of dead locos at York. It's a working museum. And better still, there's a branch somewhere near you.